So let's talk about that, the fact that the discontinued 350 Rand grant is now making a comeback. To talk a little bit more about this, we speak to Hoodah Abrahams-Fayker, who is the Black Sash National Advocacy Manager. Very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. I was wondering what your thoughts are. That isn't it ironic that it had to take this horrific period that we've come out of for the reintroduction of this grant, which people have said we should have never stopped at that point anyhow?
Yes, exactly. I mean, Black Sash has been consistently calling for the grant to be continued. And it's actually quite sad that lives had to be lost and property had to be damaged before government considered it and is now implementing it. The situation in terms of why the grant was introduced in the first place is still there. There is high unemployment. We're still living in a pandemic, and we now under level 3 lockdown restrictions. But many jobs have been lost with the restrictions, and so we are disappointed that it first had to stop and now again reinstated. So on the one hand, we welcome the decision to reinstate the grant, and we're very pleased that it has been extended to include unemployed caregivers who receive the grant, because about 95% of caregivers are women and who are unfairly discriminated against, because as individuals in their own right, they have not been eligible for the COVID SRD grant.
But I want to understand from you. I want to understand from Black Sash whether or not there is engagement with NGOs such as yourselves or communities on the policy design of these safety nets, because at the end of the day, they have to be effective. The president has announced new changes now, but they are not aimed at getting people out of cyclical poverty, but just how effective can they be? Are you able to tell us about the impact?
We are actually launching a report tomorrow on the impacts of the COVID SRD grant. And while there's been an acknowledgement that the amount of the grant is very little, with 350 Rand, but at the same time, it has helped beneficiaries of the grant because they were able to use that in different ways to be able to feed themselves and their families. So it has been a help, but obviously not enough. And the grant is a means of being able to participate in the local economy and also be able to provide some means of transport, for example, to look for jobs, to be entrepreneurial and try and sell and have a small business. So there's definitely been advantages to the grant where people have actually managed to find ways of getting some kind of income besides the grant and use it to supplement.
So I know you say you're only going to release your report tomorrow, but what do you look into when you look at the targeting performance of such social grants? Or do you look at their flexibility? What are you looking at in terms of their impact? The impact is in terms of, has it helped people to provide a lifeline? So yes, it has, but there's also been a lot of shortcomings with the grant in terms of access to the grant. It was an online system, so by default many were excluded. There was also administrative challenges. The payment of the grants were also problematic. So those were all shortcomings of the grant, and the fact that it was of a limited duration. Also, who was eligible for the grant, and that has been addressed in some way with the introduction of unemployed caregivers being able to get the grant. President Ramaphosa revealed that as well as out-of-work citizens aged between 18 to 59 who receive no other grants, unemployed caregivers who do receive other SASSA payments will now be able to claim this 350 Rand per month handout. Is it a welcome change? Does it have a potential to maximize, or at least the potential for redistributing income in one way or the other?
Yes, and I mean, first of all, it's not a handout. It's a social grant where the government is obligated to provide
social assistance for those who cannot support themselves. And so in the context where there's little job creation, then a social grant is then a policy that should be introduced by government on a permanent basis. And that's what Black Sash is asking for. But at the same time, you must look at the child support grant is for the child, and a caregiver is receiving that money on behalf of her children. She's not receiving a grant in her own right. The grant for a child is below the food poverty line. So that in itself is very little. So the added amount of 350 Rand as an unemployed caregiver would help contribute to be able to sustain her in her individual right. So yes, definitely, that is definitely will assist in terms of providing a lifeline.
Is there enough of a gender lens that is applied to the design and implementation of some of these social grants, given the fact that our demographic, we've seen, is more child-headed households, more women-led households? Is there that taken into consideration when there's this blanket social income grant that is designed?
Well, I think now it's the first step in looking at it through a gender lens, because before, at the end of the day, the COVID SRD grant was only for unemployed, excluding people who are already on the SASSA database. And from announcements made by DSD, most of the unemployed that received the grant were actually male. And that was not because women didn't need the grant, it was because they were automatically excluded. But much more needs to be done to look at women in terms of being able to partake in the economy and see them in their own individual capacity so that they are able to participate in the economy.
Just very quickly, how far then will it take us to an ideal basic income grant?
Well, this would be a stepping stone. I mean, we already have a means-tested grant for the children, elderly and disabled. And there was a glaring omission of not providing social assistance for the vulnerable unemployed. And this was acknowledged by the United Nations in terms of their report, where they said that the government should take steps to provide social assistance for those who are unemployed between 18 to 59 years. So this is definitely in the right direction, but obviously the amount is too little, and that needs to be expanded to become permanent, and then work towards a phased-in approach so that we can have a universal basic income grant for all.
All right, thank you so much for speaking to us. Hoodah Abrahams-Fayker is Black Sash National Advocacy Manager.